the ethics of virtue. In this module, we are going to be talking about a different approach to morality, an approach that differs from the previous types of morality we've looked at in that we're not so worried about what the outcome is of a particular action. So previous versions of ethics or different ethical theories, like utilitarianism, for example, held that an action was right or wrong based on the outcome, whether you had good outcomes or whether you had bad outcomes. Something like the Kantian account says that actions are right if they meet one of two criteria, or three, depending on how you interpret the categorical imperative. It says, well, if an action is right, then it's going to be one in which it could be universalized. In other words, it could be applied to everyone. And Kant also held that always treat people as an end and never as a means. So it was all about the way in which we ought to act in terms of right and wrong actions. In one, the outcomes are what mattered, what made it right or wrong. For Kant, it was doing something for the right reasons. But virtue asks us to look at morality from a different sort of perspective. So the virtue ethics dates back at least to Aristotle, and that's 325 BC, in his Nicomachean Ethics. Virtue ethics dates back to Aristotle around 325 BC in his Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle's central question is, what is the good of man? So what Aristotle wants to know is what makes for a good person. So notice we're not actually about good actions. We're not saying which actions are right or wrong. Rather, we're looking at ethics as a sort of characteristic of the individual. We're asking about character. What kind of person do you want to be, rather than what kind of actions do you engage in? So this is where virtue ethics differs from other approaches, consequentialist approaches, or even deontological approaches to ethics. So the first question Aristotle asks when approaching the issue of virtue, when he wants to know what is a virtuous person or what does it take for a person to be a virtuous person, is he first looks at the question of what is the good or the supreme good that we're sort of aiming at. So for Aristotle, happiness is the supreme good chosen for itself and never for something else. So in this way, in this sense, Aristotle and sort of the utilitarians agree that happiness is sort of an important part of ethics. But what Aristotle does with happiness is a little bit different. What Aristotle wants to know is what's going to make us have a happy life, right? What sort of characteristics do we have to have in order to lead a good life? And he thinks this is more than a mere truism. So, for example, if I ask you, what is your reason for taking this course, for example? You might say, well, I'm taking this course because it fulfills a requirement. So, okay, fulfills a requirement. Why do you want to fulfill your requirement? You say, well, because I want to graduate. Well, why do you want to graduate? Well, I want to graduate because I want to get a good job. Well, why do you want to get a good job? Well, I want to make money. I say, oh, why do you want to make money? Is it because you want to roll around in the money? Is that what will make you happy? Yay, I've got all this money. No, it's probably because you want to buy things. So you say, well, because I want to be able to buy things. I want to be able to take care of, say, my family or myself. I want to be able to have a nice place to live. Okay, and once you get all the things, why do you want these things? Why do you want to get these things? You say, well, because then it'll make me happy. So for Aristotle, he says, look, the end that we seek is happiness. I don't say I want to be happy, and then once I'm happy, I'll be able to do something else. By and large, we say we want to be happy because that's the sort of end goal in and of itself. That's what we want to achieve. So all this other stuff is just about achieving happiness. Now, this is different than the happiness of the utilitarians, right? The happiness of the utilitarians is really about good outcomes, about pleasurable sensations or something else. So it's different in that respect. And happiness is sort of a state of being for the virtue ethicist. But of course, we have to ask, well, what is the nature of happiness? What's going to make us happy? And so Aristotle has to look at this to decide how we're going to achieve happiness. So if we know that that's what we're shooting for, want to be happy, that the nature of this happiness is sort of unknown right now. In other words, we want to say this is where you get the sort of standard, philosophers, what is the meaning of life sort of question. What's the meaning of life? What do I have to do to lead a good life and so forth? This is the origin of that in sort of the ancient Greeks, which were really concerned about this issue of character and what kind of person you are, not just what kind of actions. So virtue for Aristotle is tied to function. So for someone to be happy or for a thing to be good in some sense is for it to fulfill or perform its function in the right way. So happiness, or that which makes someone happy, is tied to the proper functioning of a thing. So we're going to have to figure out, at least on Aristotle's account, what it is to function well as a human being. All right. So if we look at function, take the example of a hammer. What makes a good hammer is that which functions well at hammering. And you can pick any other sort of examples, right? What makes a good light is something that's good at illuminating things, right? So a vase doesn't make a good hammer, at least a vase that's made up of clay or pottery or glass. That's not going to function well as a hammer. A good hammer is going to have certain characteristics that makes it good for just that job, and a hammer is not going to be good at other jobs. So what we need from human beings is to look at the unique function of man. What does it mean for a human being to function well? So we need to find that unique function. Now notice he's saying unique function because he thinks, of course, many things have different functions. Right? You can use a hammer for a number of things. I mean, use it for hammering. Of course, a hammer could be used, I suppose, as a weapon of some sort. It probably wouldn't function as well as that, but it would work to do other things. So we got to figure out what is the unique function of man. So for Aristotle, the unique function is his power of thought. So Aristotle actually, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he actually goes through a number of possible unique functions. So he said, well, is existence unique? Is it the fact that we exist? And he says, well, no, but plenty of things exist. And then he says, well, is it the sense that we are a living being? Is that what makes us unique? So what separates us from things like rocks? So rocks exist, but rocks aren't alive. So Aristotle says, is it living thing? And then he rejects this, saying, well, plants exist, or plants are alive. He says, well, maybe it's the fact that we perceive our external world. We have perceptions. We know, we sort of experience our environment. Aristotle says, well, no, it's not that either, because animals do that. So he says, what's the one thing, at least from the Aristotelian view, that's unique? And it's the fact that we think. So Aristotle wouldn't look at plants or obviously inanimate objects or even animals as actually having the power of thought. And by thought here is really looking at reason, right? The ability to reason. So he thinks that if we sort of develop that unique function, that sort of excelling at that function will actually make us happy. So whatever virtue is, it's going to be tied to reason. It's going to be tied to that unique aspect of human beings. So what is this sort of excellence? How do we achieve this sort of excellence? Well, to achieve excellence in life, he thinks that we have to have reason plus some sort of virtue will get us excellence. And so for him, a life of reason, as he says, is an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue over a complete life. Let me sort of break this down to sort of understand what Aristotle's talking about. Aristotle's looking for our unique function. He says its unique function is reason, but it's got to be reasoning well. It's got to be reasoning in line with some sort of principle, some way of sort of judging how we ought to be, right? What sort of characteristics we ought to embrace. So an activity of the soul, and by soul, we have to remember that for the ancient Greeks, soul was not the sort of soul we have in sort of Judeo-Christianity or even Islam, right? It's not that sort of immaterial part of us that transcends this world and goes on to another place. For the Greeks, soul is really synonymous with reason, right? The rational part of us is the immaterial part of us. So for the Greeks, it wasn't really a religious concept so much as there's the physical part and then there's the part that reasons. So it's this reasoning part in conformity with virtue. Now for Aristotle, over a complete life is important because Aristotle says we don't actually have a good life, or we can't judge having a good life until the end of our life, until our life is complete. So the activity of soul in conformity with virtue over a complete life. So your life can go sort of better or worse as you go along, but to truly say whether you've led a good life, whether your life has been good, we really have to wait till the end, till the life is sort of over. It's also interesting that Aristotle allows that your life can go better or worse after you're dead. So most of us would probably think, well, look, my life goes a certain way. I have a certain amount of happiness, a certain amount of satisfaction. At the end of my life, that's it. And if someone were to look at my life, they say, that person's life went well, or that person's life didn't go so well. For Aristotle, that's not necessarily the case. So for Aristotle, you can actually have a life that goes well, and then a life that gets worse. So, for example, let's say part of your life or part of what you make as a good life is to have children that are successful, that do well after you're gone. And so for Aristotle, let's say when you die, your children are doing really well and they're succeeding, they're self-sufficient and so forth, all the things, they're healthy. And you say, oh, well, that person's life went well. So all of the sort of virtues that you cultivated, all the things that were in your life, including your family, things have gone well. Well, if after you die, some sort of tragedy were to befall your children, and usually this could, for example, be a tragedy of their own making, right? So some bad decisions or bad investments make your children suddenly now poor. They lose a lot of what they have, their wealth, or they're dishonored in some way. That, for Aristotle, could actually mean your life didn't go as well as it did. In other words, your life has actually changed. It went worse. It went better at one point, it went worse at another. It's not so much important that we buy into this part of Aristotle, but just to know that for Aristotle, a virtuous life is a life in total. It's not one action or two actions that make you virtuous, right? So you don't become virtuous by saying doing good things. So if we look back at other moral theories that are focused on what the right action is or what the good action is, the virtue ethicist isn't so concerned about each individual action, right? It's sort of the habits or the actions over your complete life that are actually going to matter. Now, for Aristotle, if you said, well, okay, this all sounds great. I should have reason. I should apply my reason to my actions. I should mix this reason with some kind of virtue. That's going to lead me to this excellence. Excellence in this case being the sort of good life that we want to lead. How do I know what those actions are, what those virtues are, I should say, that I'm looking to achieve? And for Aristotle, he thinks that all of this boils down to a rational principle, the golden mean. So it's the golden mean. Virtue for Aristotle is the mean between two extremes relative to the individual. So again, let's sort of parse this out. Aristotle says is that when an action is virtuous, or the virtuous action, is one that's going to be in between sort of excess and deficiency. So if I want to know what the right action is, what I should look for is that mean between the two extremes. So take the example, what is bravery? Well, bravery for Aristotle, for example, would be the mean between two other sort of types of actions. So there's rashness on one side. So the person who sort of charges out without thinking, rushes in and says, that's rash. And then the other side of it would be the person who sort of cowers, right? The coward who goes the other way. So what does it mean to be brave? Well, it's the midpoint, the median between cowardice and rashness. And that's what we mean by bravery. And we can look at other sorts of actions in the same way. Right? There are excess and deficiency when it comes to, example, eating. What's the proper amount of food? Well, if you have a lot of food, if you eat without sort of care about how much you should be eating and whether it's healthy for you, then there's gluttony. And on the other side, there's sort of asceticism or starvation on the other side where you don't eat enough. So clearly that's not correct. But in the middle, the mean is sort of temperance, right? Right in the middle between gluttony on one end and sort of starvation or deficiency on the other. So this is how these are the sorts of virtues that we ought to cultivate. So temperance is a virtue, bravery is a virtue, friendship is a virtue, right? And these for Aristotle are means between various extremes. Now, the person who's good, the person who achieves sort of excellence in their life and excellence of character is going to be the one who habitually follows the mean. And all that means is that one in which the golden mean or virtue becomes a habit. So for Aristotle, if someone says, well, how do you become virtuous? So it's one thing to understand what virtue is. Virtue is a combination of reason with, virtue is reason plus the virtue of the golden mean, the rational principle, the golden mean. This is what makes you a virtuous person. But how do I become virtuous? Well, for Aristotle, to become virtuous is simply to be in the habit of doing virtuous things. And so being brave as a course of habit, being temperate, being a friend as just part of habitually who you are. And so how do I do this? Well, in the Aristotelian view, to become a virtuous person is simply to do virtuous acts to the point where they become a habit. And this is not actually far off from what we think psychologically happens with most of us, right? Most people that we look at that are good, when we say that, oh, that's a good person, or they're an honest person, for example. An honest person is one who habitually tells the truth, right? So we don't look at someone who just tells the truth once in a while. Oh, every once in a while they tell me the truth, or sometimes they tell me the truth. Or, well, I can't always tell if they're telling me the truth, but they do tell the truth once in a while. That's not what we call a truthful person or an honest person. An honest person is one that we look at and says, no, that's just who they are. That's part of their character. Well, what are we really saying? It's saying that they habitually do particular actions. So the brave person, the honest person, whatever virtue you want to discuss, the generous person, for example, is one who's habitually generous. So that's how we become virtuous on the Aristotelian view. And this also seems to go along with our own sort of moral development, right? So when we look at how people actually become or embrace the sort of moral ideas that they have, is usually because it's formed from habit, right? It's habit that our parents have instilled in us, or friends or relatives, or even our religious associations. I'd say, well, this person always does this, or this person is always honest. Well, why are they always honest? Where did that come from? Well, it probably came from sort of mimicking the people around them. If you have parents that emphasize honesty, then you're probably an honest person. And of course, vice is the same way. So for Aristotle, you can, of course, habitually become a bad person by not following the mean, right? By embracing other sorts of characteristics. So virtue ethics is really a combination of reason and the golden mean. Now, this is, of course, relative to the person. So when you read Aristotle says, well, what does it mean to be brave? Well, it's going to be the same. Everyone ought to be brave as a virtue. That's a good thing. But bravery is going to mean different things. So, for example, we often say of someone, for example, who's disabled, that they're very brave the way they've dealt with the adversity of their disability. Well, for you or I, for example, maybe getting up in the morning and getting dressed or taking a shower or something isn't a brave act. Or going out in public or going to a job isn't a brave act. But relative to someone where that's an extremely difficult thing to do, just because of the challenges, whether they're physical challenges or mental challenges, you might say they're very brave for what they do or how they live their life. So it's relative to the individual. The same goes with excess and deficiency when it comes to food, right? What it means to be temperate in what we eat is going to be based on how much you need. So if you're an athlete, you're probably going to eat a lot more than someone who's not an athlete. And we would say that the person who eats as much as an athlete who isn't an athlete isn't exactly being temperate in the amount of food that they eat. But what it means to be that mean when it comes to, for example, food is really going to be based on your particular situation. So the virtues are there. They're always virtues, but what they mean or how they're interpreted is going to be relative to the individual. Now, contemporary virtue ethics is similar to the Aristotelian. There's been some divergence from the Aristotelian view. So for contemporary virtue ethicists, virtue is a trait of character manifested in habitual action which is good for a person to have. So in other words, very similar to Aristotle. In other words, the contemporary virtue ethicists have embraced a lot of what Aristotle was also advocating. So it's a trait of character, right? It's going to be manifested in habit. So to say that I know that you are of good character means that I've recognized over and over you doing the same actions that are good, the same good actions. So what are the virtues? Well, there's no actually absolute list of virtues. So when we talk about virtue ethics, there's a little bit of a sort of, well, here's a list, but it's not a complete list. There may be more that we add to this. For example, we have benevolence, fairness, self-discipline, self-reliance, honesty, tolerance, conscientiousness, loyalty, justice. These are just a few of the sort of virtues that we ought to cultivate in ourselves. At least that's how the contemporary virtue ethicists would have it. So when we look at issues, when we look at individuals, and we want to judge their actions, whether their actions are virtuous or not, we simply ask, are they demonstrating these sorts of virtues, right? Does that action demonstrate benevolence? Right, helping others? Is that a virtue of fairness? Is that individual acting fairly? self-discipline, self-reliance, all the same. Honesty, we can ask the same question. So for contemporary virtue ethicists, we're really embracing the same sort of idea that the Aristotelian has. It's a trait of character, it's a habitual action. And here, as you see on your screen there, are an example of a few of these types of virtues. Now, why are the virtues important? So even if we buy into this and say, well, yes, we should be concerned about character. Character is important, and maybe we shouldn't be so concerned about individual actions. We should be thinking in terms of what makes us better as individuals. So what are the importance of virtues? According to both virtue ethicists and sort of the classic Aristotelian virtue ethics, virtuous persons will fare better in life. So being a good virtuous person means you'll have a better life overall. And again, we see that with Aristotle, right? So if you combine your reason with the golden mean, this is going to lead to sort of excellence and excellence across your whole life. So in instilling in yourself these virtues, practicing things to the point where these become habitual, you're going to have a better life. Virtues are needed to live well. So for many virtue ethicists, the idea is that by cultivating certain virtues, or these virtues are needed for us to engage in various activities with others. So living well ourselves as individuals. So for example, self-reliance is a good thing, right? That's one of those things that will live better if we develop the virtue of self-reliance as opposed to being dependent on others all the time. Now, we're all, of course, dependent on people to a certain degree, but the idea of being as self-sufficient as possible is probably a good thing that will live better than if we constantly have to wait for others to do things for us. Also, we need virtues to live in community with others. So honesty, benevolence, tolerance, add things like justice, fairness, and so forth are good things in a community. So notice that when you live around people that have these virtues, or that, quote unquote, we say virtuous people, that those communities tend to be better than ones which people aren't virtuous. So for the virtue ethicists, look, these are characteristics, they're going to say, traits that we need if we're going to live successfully. If we could stay away from everyone, right, if we never had to interact with other people, maybe the virtues wouldn't be as important. But given that we want to live in community, the virtues are necessary for those interactions. Virtues are also necessary to pursue our own ends and cope with life's challenges. So what the virtue ethicists would also argue is that at certain points in our life, we're going to experience challenges. And it's not going to simply be about doing certain actions. It's actually going to be, do we have certain characteristics that allow us to deal with those challenges? So whether it's illness, our own or another, whether it's facing adversity, whether, again, the sort of ideas of self-reliance, these are the sorts of challenges that we may come up against, and having the right character traits, self-reliance or endurance, even things like friendship, these may help us cope. So if we're the type of person, a virtuous person who sort of demonstrates the sort of virtue of friendship, that this, when times are challenging, will probably be to our benefit, right? This will be when we face challenges, there'll be friends around us to help with those challenges, on top of just our own characteristics to pursue those sort of that we need when facing various challenges. Now, talk about the sort of nature of the virtues. And I've already alluded to some of these things just so previously, but the first question might be, are the virtues the same for everyone? And as I mentioned, yes, they are the same for everyone. So in other words, if it's a virtue for everyone. It's not sort of some people, it's a virtue for some and not others. All people need virtues, just to different degrees. So certain virtues, for example, might be necessary for some cultures where it's not as necessary for others. So in very individualistic societies, it might be the case that self-reliance is more important than more communal cultures. Right? So if you lived in small villages or in small tribal groups, it might be that friendship or fairness or something else is actually more important, whereas self-reliance or something else might be important in a more individualistic society. But in either case, it's still the case that we're going to need the virtues, that we all need virtues to one degree or another. So we all are going to need things like benevolence or friendship or justice or fairness. Now, there is it's worth noting that there are various types of virtue ethics. contemporary virtue ethics. One virtue ethics approach is what's termed radical virtue ethics. And a radical virtue ethicist wants to get rid of the notion of morally right and morally wrong altogether and use virtuous and non-virtuous. So when you say an action is right, or that action was right, or okay, or morally justified, or you say it's wrong or morally wrong, the radical virtuous says, no, we shouldn't even speak in terms of morally right and morally wrong. We should say it's virtuous or non-virtuous. Now, there is a sort of problem with replacing all morality with virtue in this way. And I want to just sort of stop here for a minute and note that virtue ethics, depending on how you approach it, is in many ways compatible with other sorts of moral views. So, for example, I might think that, that Kant is right, that actions are right if you treat people as an end, never as a means. If it's something that applies to everyone, so there might be a sense of fairness or justice requires that laws and rules, moral rules, apply to everyone. That in many ways is still compatible with the idea that I ought to instill in myself the view or the characteristic in which I demonstrate that people should be treated equally or be treated with respect, or that I owe benevolence, help to others. So virtue can, in fact, be compatible, where you can think of one as self-centered in the sense that I want to develop myself as a moral being, and then other regarding in my actions are going to demonstrate certain actions, that there's a compatibility between the virtues we instill in ourselves and the types of actions that come from the virtues. So there is still a compatibility. You can in some ways be a virtue ethicist, be sort of embrace the idea of, yes, there's certain things certain characteristics we should try to develop in ourselves. And the reason we might want to develop those characteristics are for all the reasons a virtue ethicist says, but also because the actions that flow from those virtues are morally right or morally good actions. So what are the advantages? Well, there's a certain advantage to viewing ethics in some ways like the radical virtue ethicist says. One is moral motivation. I know we don't speak much about moral motivation in this course. Moral motivation is really the issue of what makes us act morally. And so virtue ethics seems to capture really what we do when we act morally. So moral motivation, certain situations are handled by an appeal to virtue rather than right action or duty. So if I really want to look at why I do certain things, rarely do I do them because it maximizes the overall good or because I have some sort of, moral duty to do something for someone. In fact, I probably do things because of some virtue I feel. So visiting a friend in the hospital. So if you're someone like me who isn't particularly happy going to the hospital, I don't think most people are, you say, I hate hospitals. Well, if I go to visit my friend in the hospital, why am I doing it? Am I doing it because I sit back and say, well, I'm going to be made miserable by this, but my friend's happiness will be increased by a certain amount, and perhaps my prestige will be increased. Well, when people see me going and helping or seeing my friend, they're going to think I'm a nice person, and that's going to maximize utility in some way. Is that what you think about? Maybe you do. I think most of us probably not. And the other one might say, well, I have an obligation, right? It's not that I want to go. It's not because it's going to maximize the good, but because I have an obligation to this person. Maybe they came to see you when you were sick or in the hospital. And that's also probably not why you do it. You don't think you do it because, it's right, or I have some sort of duty to do it. You say, no, there's something else. Well, what is it? Well, it's probably because of something like friendship or love or loyalty. You say, look, the reason I came to the hospital is because you're my friend, because this is what friends do, or this is what someone who loves someone else does, and so forth. So there's the one advantage of sort of looking at morality through the lens of virtue is that it seems to cover our moral motivation about things. The reason we do things is often part of our character traits and the sort of virtues that we sort of have embraced, as opposed to some sort of abstract obligation that we might have. The other advantage that virtue ethics has is that it sort of relieves some of the doubt about the idea, or it sort of plays into the idea that we really don't act impartially. So relationships with family and friends are difficult to account for in other moral approaches. So it doesn't seem the right way to characterize, say, your relationship with a spouse or a child as a, utility relationship or a duty-based relationship or something like that, right? That's not why, or that's not how we generally view those relationships. So I don't prioritize my children over other children because it just so happens that prioritizing my children maximizes overall utility in some way. And if it didn't, I would prioritize someone else's kids. It seems that no, we are actually partial to individuals. And why is that? Well, it seems that the virtues are better able to handle why I might have more obligations or more feelings towards or concern for those who are close to me. So there is, most of ethics, and we said at the very beginning of this course that, impartiality is a central component of ethics when it comes to actions. And yet we don't always act impartially. In fact, a lot of times there are situations where we think, in fact, it would be wrong if we acted impartial. So the sort of classic kind of example is, imagine you're on a boat with your child and another child, and both of them fall in the water, and you can only save one. Well, which child do you save? Well, most of us would say if I jumped in and saved my own child, assuming I can't save both, that I didn't do anything wrong. And in fact, it would be a little bit weird if I didn't save my child, right? We might think that, wait, there's almost something off. And yet it seems that other moral theories wouldn't necessarily hold that I ought to save my own child, right? So if I have a duty to both children on a sort of Kantian approach, then it's sort of up for grabs. The question is, well, I'm not sure how I make my decision. If on utility grounds, I'd say, well, is my child smarter than the other kid? Are they going to do better in life? Do I have a better chance that they might cure cancer or do something socially good? Will it make me, do I love my kid more than the parents love theirs? So there'll be a disutility for me to lose my own kid. We usually don't go through that kind of thought process. And so virtue ethics has the advantage that I don't have to. That in fact, the virtue that I have a friendship or love or loyalty to, my child might actually just answer the question. Of course, I'm going to save them. So let's not pretend that we are impartial in certain sorts of relationships. Now, again, we might be impartial in general. So, for example, I might say everyone deserves their day in court, for example, and they should all have representation and people should be treated fairly and so forth and so on. That's never in doubt. And the virtue ethicist and the non-virtue ethicist would all agree. The question is what happens when I'm dealing with these sort of close personal relationships? Does abstract morality, like those of the Kantian or the utilitarian, do they actually can't sort of handle those sorts of situations? So what are some of the problems? Virtue ethics sounds pretty good. We want to be good people, at least we should, one would think. Of course, that's morally laden as well, right? Should you want to be a good person? But I think that most of us would agree that being a good person is a good thing. Virtue ethics sounds like this is a sort of way to go. Well, one of the problems of virtue ethics is incompleteness, right? So take an example. Let's say I have a decision whether I should lie or not lie. So I say, well, how would the virtue ethicist approach this? So I say, lie or don't lie. Now, I think to myself, well, what virtue applies to this situation, right? What kind of characteristic is it that would sort of apply? In this case, it's honesty. Honesty is a virtue. We know that honesty is a virtue. It's a good thing to be honest. So what does it mean to be honest? Well, to be honest is one who follows a rule such as do not lie, right? Don't lie. So if I'm asking even what it is I'm habitually sort of instilling in myself, what kind of habit have I gotten into? Well, to say that I'm being honest means that, well, I don't lie habitually. So I'm following a rule such as don't lie. But why is this a rule? So if honesty is a virtue, and what it means to be honest boils down to some sort of rule like don't lie or do not lie, don't tell a lie, I can still ask the further question, yeah, but why is do not lie a rule? And once I get to this point, I have to go to some non-virtue consideration. In other words, there's got to be something about honesty, about not lying, that justifies the rule, which then justifies the habit that I develop from the rule. And I can't, of course, say because, oh, well, honesty is a virtue. So why is this a rule? Because honesty, well, then it becomes circular. Notice I now have to go outside and find some other consideration. So maybe it's because I look at sort of a Kantian rule, or I look at the bad consequences of lying in some sort of utilitarian thing. But notice now that virtue is sort of incomplete. In other words, I don't exactly know why certain things are virtues, right? If these virtues are based on rules and rules have to have some sort of justification, then I can't appeal back to virtue. So this is the incompleteness, the problem of incompleteness with virtues, that ultimately at the end of the day, virtue ethics seems, at least on this sort of argument, to rely on some kind of other moral consideration. Now, this again isn't necessarily to say that virtue ethics doesn't have value, but this is where I mentioned before, where it is possible to think of virtue ethics as sort of being compatible with other theories. So once I know what rules are good, what things I ought to do, then maybe those things I ought to do as a matter of habit. And then once I've developed those as habit, that's what we call a virtue. But standing in and of itself, here's a problem with sort of replacing all morality with virtuous, non-virtuous, right? Instead of saying morally right and morally wrong, it's saying replacing that with virtuous or non-virtuous. This is going to be problematic. And why is it going to be problematic? Just for this problem of incompleteness. This is one of the sort of problems with virtue ethics. Now, again, this is not to say that virtue ethics can't be appealing and that it doesn't have value, but it just means that it might not be in and of itself complete. There's a couple of other problems with virtue ethics. And for example, there's the problem of conflicts of virtues. Now, conflicts of virtues are similar to other sorts of moral situations or other moral theories. So what happens, for example, when friendship and justice conflict? So let's say you have a friend who's done something wrong. So you have an obligation to your friend in this sense, right? There's a virtue of friendship that you should help your friends and support them even in times of trouble. But then there's the idea of justice, right? That we should be impartial, that people should be treated fairly. And if your friend has done something that treats someone unfairly, then now I've got a conflict. And so what happens when two virtues conflict? Well, virtue ethics doesn't give us a clear answer to the question of conflict of virtues. Now, this is not unique to this. We mentioned the Kantian has a similar sort of problem. The utilitarian might in some way even have a problem when you have two actions that have exactly the same utility value. So if you come across those situations, conflicts are problematic for other theories as well. But notice with virtue ethics, once we sort of said that friendship is a virtue and justice is a virtue, it sort of stops there. And so we do have a problem with this. And then, of course, the last problem I want to talk about is there a virtue to cover every situation? So for any good reason given in favor of doing an action, there's a corresponding virtue that consists of a disposition to accept and act on that reason. So when we look at a new situation that comes up, the question is, are there enough virtues to cover that particular situation? So say, for example, something like stem cell research. I say, what is a virtuous researcher? Now, it's unclear what sort of answer we'd have. So what would the virtuous person do when it comes to stem cell research? Do they do the research or not do the research? Do they harvest the stem cells or not harvest the stem cells? It's unclear if there's a virtue that covers that particular situation. And if there isn't one that covers that situation, then we've got a problem, right? Now we've got to either come up with a new virtue or try to sort of fit one of the other virtues into the situation, and that might not be a natural fit. So are there enough virtues out there? It's sort of an open question. As I mentioned, there are the list of virtues that I gave you, but there are others who have proposed more extensive lists of virtues. But this remains a problem, whether virtue ethics can, in fact, deal with every situation that's sort of thrown at it. So there we have our sort of take on virtue ethics. Again, there's really sort of two main distinctions, things you want to keep in mind. One, there's the sort of Aristotelian approach to virtue ethics. So the original virtue ethics is this idea of the good of the individual over a life, that it's reason combined with virtue, in this case the golden mean, which leads to excellence in life. And the virtuous act is the one that falls between the mean between two extremes. The contemporary sort of approach to virtue is similar. It's a habit of action that it's good for us to have, listed some of those things that are good. And so when we're looking at issues, whether it's in business ethics or engineering ethics or life in general, we might want to ask the question, does this action really demonstrate these sorts of virtues, right? Is this what a friend would do? Is this what a loyal person would do? Is this what a just person would do? And when we ask ourselves those questions, when we ask whether those actions are virtuous in this way, then we're being a virtue ethicist.